He hadn't cooked a meal for 2 in 6 years, but there he stood at the stove on a Tuesday evening, stirring a pot of soup he didn't need, in a kitchen that still had a child's crayon drawings taped to the fridge, trying to remember the last time he'd been nervous about anything that wasn't related to his son. Cal didn't know what he was doing. That was the honest truth of it. He was 38 years old. He owned a small contracting business in Barrie, Ontario, drove a truck that smelled like sawdust and drywall compound, and could tell you within 20 minutes how long any job would take. He was not a person who second-guessed himself. He had not been that person since he'd had to become a different kind of person entirely. The kind who learned on the fly, who figured things out, who did not have the luxury of standing in his own kitchen at 6:15 on a Tuesday wondering whether he should cancel a dinner that hadn't even been arranged by him. His son had arranged it. Finn was 7. He would be 8 in March. He had his mother's eyes and his grandfather's stubbornness and a particular gift for doing things that seemed small until he realized they weren't small at all. The dinner had started, as most things in Cal's life started, with Finn paying close attention to something Cal thought he wasn't paying attention to. Cal had been on the phone with his friend Adrian while Finn was at the kitchen table, supposedly working on a worksheet about water cycles. He had said Adrian's name twice during the call, had said the word date once, had said the words, "I don't know, maybe, I'll think about it," in a way that he recognized even as he said them as not actually meaning, "I'll think about it." He'd hung up and turned around. Finn was watching him from the kitchen table with the expression of someone who had just received information they intended to use. "You're going on a date," Finn said. "It's not a date." Finn's expression said he understood this to be untrue. He didn't bring it up again for 4 days. Cal had assumed, the way you assume things when you want to assume them, that the subject had been dropped. He found out it hadn't dropped at all when Adrian called back and said, with the particular energy of someone who had been gotten to, that everything had been arranged. Saturday. A restaurant on Dunlop Street. A woman named Wren who worked with Adrian's wife at the hospital. 7 o'clock. Done. Cal said he hadn't agreed to anything. Adrian said Finn had called him. Cal stood in his hallway for a moment processing this. "Your 7-year-old called me," Adrian said, "and told me his dad needed a push." His exact words. I'm not going to argue with the 7-year-old Cal. He was very persuasive. Cal had walked into the kitchen and found Finn doing a puzzle on the floor, perfectly composed. "You called Adrian," Cal said. Finn placed a piece of the puzzle carefully. "I used the tablet," he said. "I knew his number from your contacts. I didn't call long distance or anything." His voice had the tone of a person clarifying only the logistical concerns, not the ethical ones. Cal had stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, and then, because there was nothing useful to say to that, he'd gone back to making dinner. That had been 3 weeks ago. The restaurant was tomorrow. Cal was stirring soup he didn't need. He had agreed in the end, because agreeing had felt marginally less exhausting than the alternative, and because some part of him that he'd kept quiet for a long time had heard Adrian say her name and felt something shift slightly, the way ice shifts before it breaks, not dramatically, just enough to know that something underneath has changed. Wren. He didn't know her face. He knew she was a pediatric nurse. He knew she'd moved to Barrie 2 years ago from somewhere in Nova Scotia. He knew Adrian's wife liked her a great deal, which was a meaningful endorsement because Adrian's wife was not easily impressed by people. He was still stirring soup when Finn appeared in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas, even though it was only 7 o'clock and no one had suggested bed yet. "You're nervous," Finn said. "It wasn't a question." "I'm making soup." "You always make soup when you don't know what to do with your hands." Cal looked at his son. This was true. He had known it was observable. Finn came and pulled out a kitchen chair and sat in it the way he sat in things, completely, like he intended to stay. He had Cal's dark hair, unwashed and sticking up on one side in a way that Cal was fairly sure he'd gotten from sleeping sideways. His pajama top had a small dinosaur on the chest. It was the kind of detail that could make a person feel something in their ribcage if they let it. "What if she doesn't like me?" Cal said. He hadn't meant to say it. It was a real question he'd been carrying for a week, and it had come out before he could stop it. Finn considered this with a seriousness that was disproportionate to his age and proportionate to the question. "Then you be nice to her anyway," he said. People like being treated nicely even when they're not sure yet. Cal looked at his son for a moment. When did you figure that out? Finn shrugged with one shoulder. I don't know. From you, probably. Cal turned back to the stove. The soup was done. It had been done for 10 minutes. He ate dinner with Finn and washed the dishes and helped with a reading assignment and sat on the edge of Finn's bed while Finn told him, in exhaustive detail, about something that had happened at recess involving a puddle and a misunderstanding about whose idea the puddle had been. Cal listened to all of it. He was good at listening to all of it. It was one of the things he'd gotten better at over 6 years of being the only person in the house who listened. After Finn fell asleep, Cal sat in the living room with the lights low and did not watch the television that was on in front of him. He was thinking about a woman he'd never met. He was thinking about what it meant that he was thinking about her. He had a full life. He knew that. He knew how to say it and mean it, which was not the same thing as knowing how to say it without the small hollow underneath, the place where the word full did its best work but couldn't quite fill the whole space. He was not unhappy. He wanted to be clear about that. He had Finn, who was remarkable in ways that had nothing to do with Cal and everything to do with some quality Finn had arrived with that Cal took no credit for. He had work he was good at, a house that was his, friends who showed up, a sister in Sudbury who called every Sunday without fail. His life was not lacking. It was also, undeniably, a life that had arranged itself around an absence. The way furniture arranges itself around a space where something used to be. He went to bed. He did not sleep quickly. He found a parking spot on the street at 6:52 and sat in his truck for 11 minutes. Not because he needed to think. He had done his thinking. He had driven the 40 minutes from his house to Barry's downtown core, running through the logic of this in a way that had not helped and was not going to help, and had concluded somewhere on the 400 that the only way through a thing was to do the thing. He was sitting in the truck because the restaurant was right there, lit from inside, and his chest was doing something loud that he didn't feel like walking into a restaurant with. He had faced harder things. He knew the shape of heart. He had held his son on the day Finn's mother had died in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and quiet machinery, and he had been the one who did not come apart, because Finn was 2 and needed someone to not come apart. He had held himself together, and kept holding, and had been holding so long now that he wasn't entirely sure what it would feel like to set anything down. He got out of the truck at 7:03. The restaurant was the kind of place with exposed brick and tables with small candles on them, the kind that suggested effort without being unreasonable about it. Cal had chosen it from 3 options. Adrian had texted him and had since second-guessed the choice 17 times, which was not a normal number. He was standing near the entrance when he heard the door behind him. He turned. She was still in her coat, unwinding a scarf from around her neck, which she'd clearly been doing while walking because she'd pushed open the door one-handed and was still working the scarf loose with the other. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold. The scarf was dark green and had caught on her earring, which she hadn't noticed yet, and she was scanning the room with the alert, slightly calibrated look of someone who'd worked out in advance how they were going to appear when they arrived, and the scarf situation was working against her. Cal looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed the small space between the entrance and the door and said, quietly, "Your earring." She stopped, looked at him, looked at the scarf. "Oh," she said. And then, because she had her hands full, she held still while he reached over and eased the loop of fabric from the earring back, which took about 4 seconds and required neither of them to say anything. The scarf came free. She tucked it into her coat pocket and looked up at him. Her eyes were the color of creek water in October, not quite gray, not quite green, the shade that changed depending on what the light was doing. She was trying not to appear mortified. She was not entirely succeeding. "Thank you," she said. "That's a very good start." He didn't know what he'd expected her to say. It wasn't that. He almost smiled. "Cal," he said. "Ren," she said. They shook hands in the absurd but somehow correct way of 2 people who understood they were doing something that required some kind of formality to get through, and then the host appeared and led them to their table. They were seated near the window, which faced the street. The city outside was the ordinary kind of November. Cold dark, a few people moving with their shoulders up against the wind. Headlights trailing orange on wet pavement. Cal found it easier to look at briefly, in the moments between sentences, than to maintain the kind of uninterrupted eye contact that could turn a simple dinner into something with too much weight before it had earned it. Wren had gotten her coat off and hung it on the chair. She had on a dark burgundy sweater and the earring the scarf had caught on. The left one, a small gold leaf, was still slightly crooked. She hadn't noticed, or she had noticed and didn't care. He wasn't sure which, either was fine. She picked up the menu without looking at it and said, "I have to tell you something. And I realize saying that at the beginning of a first dinner is the kind of thing that makes people nervous, so I'll be quick." Cal put his menu down. "I knew about your son," she said, "before tonight. Dana told me about him. Adrian's wife. She said you were raising him alone. She said he was 7 and he called Adrian to arrange this." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't know if you knew that she'd told me. I figured it was better to say it than to pretend I was coming in blind." Cal was quiet for a moment. He wasn't surprised that Dana had told her. Dana was not a person who left useful information out of situations she'd helped construct. He was not even particularly bothered. What he was, in a way he hadn't anticipated, was grateful, because Wren had just done something he didn't have a word for immediately. She had chosen to clear the space between them rather than leave something in it that would sit there all evening being carefully not mentioned. "Thank you for saying that," he said. She nodded once, the kind of nod that meant received, moving on. She looked at the menu for the first time. They ordered. The conversation did what conversations sometimes do when two people have both been paying attention to things for a long time. It found its footing without a lot of preamble. She told him about the pediatric ward, which was relentless and consuming and still, after 9 years, the only place she could imagine working. He told her about the contracting business, about the particular satisfaction of a problem that had a measurable physical solution, something you could press your hand flat against and know was done. She asked how long it had been, just him and Finn. 6 years, he said, since Finn was 1. She didn't do the thing. He had learned over 6 years to recognize the thing. The particular softening of the face that meant someone was reaching for a response that was more about their own discomfort than his. She didn't reach for anything. She just held the information and nodded in the same way she'd nodded before. He found he'd been holding something in his shoulders and was no longer holding it. They talked about Nova Scotia. She'd grown up outside of Antigonish, the youngest of 4, had come to Ontario for a nursing program, and had stayed because staying had made sense, and going back would have required a decision she hadn't felt ready to make. And then the years had passed, and Barrie had become the place where she knew where things were. He understood that. He understood the way a place becomes yours, not because you chose it deliberately, but because you kept returning to it. She asked him, somewhere between the main course and the moment the waiter came and went with the dessert menu, whether he minded being asked about Finn's mother. He didn't, not the way she was asking, which was careful without being cautious. "She died," he said, 6 years ago. Cardiac event. She was 31. Wren held that for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said, and then, "Were you both working at the time?" He looked at her. "Most people don't ask that," he said. She considered this. "I work with families after hard things," she said. "I've noticed people want to talk about the person, not just the event. But I didn't want to assume." He thought about that. "She was a middle school teacher," he said. "English and drama. She had her students call her by her first name, which the principal hated. She made very good chili. She cried at commercials but not at movies." Wren smiled. The kind of smile that wasn't performing anything. "She sounds like someone worth crying at commercials over," she said. Something in Cal's chest shifted, not painfully, just moved, the way something moves when it's been very still for a long time. They said no to dessert without discussing it. Cal paid for the meal because he'd made the reservation and Wren didn't argue, which suggested she would argue about it the next time, and the specificity of that thought, the next time, came and went quickly enough that he didn't examine it. They collided their coats. The walk to the door was short and neither of them filled it with words. Outside, it was properly cold now, the kind of cold that had intentions. Their breath showed in front of them. The street had quieted since he'd arrived, fewer people. The orange headlights less frequent. They stood on the sidewalk in the way of people who have reached the end of a thing and are not entirely ready to mark it. Cal knew this part. He had been very prepared for this part. The polite end, the handshake or the slight nod, the clean conclusion that would allow him to drive home and report to Finn that yes, it had been fine, nice even, and leave it at that. He was still constructing this conclusion when Ren reached into her coat pocket. She took out her phone and then looked at it, and then, instead of whatever he'd thought she was reaching for, she pulled out a small folded piece of paper that had been tucked into the same pocket. She looked at it for a moment, then she held it out. "This was in my coat before I left tonight," she said. "I don't have a 7-year-old who could have put it there. I think my upstairs neighbor's daughter might have had something to do with it. She's 5 and has strong opinions about most things." Cal took it. He unfolded it carefully. The paper was the kind that came from a small notepad, the kind a child would steal from a kitchen counter without asking and consider this fine. The drawing was in marker, not crayon, but the essential language was the same. 2 figures, round-headed, standing side by side, with what might have been a sun in the upper corner, or might have been a large happy face. Underneath, in the large and slightly uncertain lettering of a young child, was a single line. "Be friends. It's nice." Cal stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. He became aware that he was smiling, which was inconvenient because he was also trying to process the fact that somehow, through a chain of events he could not fully reconstruct, a 5-year-old he had never met had put a piece of paper in this woman's coat pocket tonight, and Finn had called Adrian, and Adrian had called Ren's number. And here they both were, on a cold sidewalk in November, holding a drawing done in marker by someone who couldn't yet spell friends. He looked up at her. She was watching him the way she'd watched him for most of dinner. Level, patient, not waiting for anything in particular, just present. "You have no idea how she knew," he said. "I have some ideas," Ren said. "I may have mentioned once or twice that I was going on a date and was perhaps more in my head about it than was useful." He looked at the drawing again. "She couldn't spell friends," he said. "She spells it phonetically," Ren said. "She's very consistent about it. She's also, apparently, an optimist." He folded the paper along its original crease. He held it in his hand for a moment, then held it back out to her. "She should keep it," he said. "It's hers." Ren took it. She tucked it back into her coat pocket with the particular care you use with things that are small and matter. "I should go," she said. "I have an early shift." He said he understood. She said it had been a good evening. He said it had been more than good. She smiled at that, brief, real, not performing. She pulled her scarf back out of her pocket and wrapped it around her neck, this time without catching it on the earring, and then turned and walked toward the parking garage at the end of the block. Cal stood on the sidewalk and watched her go. He put his hands in his pockets. The paper was not there. He had given it back. He was aware of this in the way that you're aware of something missing from where it usually sits. He turned toward his truck. He walked, his boots on the wet pavement, the cold doing what cold did in November, settling in properly, meaning it. He counted half a block and stopped. He stood still on the sidewalk and thought about Finn at the kitchen table with the tablet, dialing Adrian's number with the particular gravity of a person who has decided that something needs to happen and has decided to be the one to make it happen. He thought about a 5-year-old in an apartment upstairs, drawing 2 round-headed figures standing side by side and someone sliding a folded piece of paper into the pocket of a coat that was hanging by the door. He thought about 6 years. The exact weight and shape of 6 years. The life that had grown up inside them. Solid, real, good. And also the habit of choosing solid and real and good over the thing that was uncertain and unscheduled and might also hurt if it went wrong. He thought about what Finn had said in the kitchen the night before, in the tone he used when he was saying something that he considered self-evident and was only saying aloud as a courtesy. People like being treated nicely, even when they're not sure yet. Call turned around. She was at the far end of the block, about to turn into the parking garage entrance. Ren. He said it at a volume that was slightly too loud for the empty street, and she heard it, and stopped, and turned. He walked toward her. He didn't run. Running felt like an overcorrection, and also the sidewalk was wet. He walked the way you walk when you've made a decision and you're not second-guessing it. But you're also not performing certainty you don't have, just walking steadily toward the thing you've decided. She waited. He stopped when he was close enough to talk at a normal volume. He had prepared no speech. He was not a speech person. What he said was, "I'd like to call you, if that's all right." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That's all right." He said he would, soon, not vaguely. She said, "Good, and then, you should get back before it gets colder." He said good night. She said good night. She turned and went into the parking garage, and he turned and went back the way he'd come, and the sidewalk was still wet, and the cold was still there, and something in his chest felt different from how it had felt 11 minutes ago in the truck. He drove home. Finn had been asleep for 2 hours when he got in. The house had the quality it always had with Finn asleep in it. Settled, particular, the shape of one person's life pressed into the quiet. Cal hung up his coat. He went to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. On the fridge, held up by a magnet shaped like a maple leaf, was a drawing Finn had made 3 weeks ago. 2 stick figures, one taller, one shorter, holding what might have been hot dogs or might have been some kind of torch, standing in front of something that might have been a house or a very large sandwich. Finn had written their names underneath in the careful letters he used for things that mattered. Dad, Finn. Cal stood at the counter for a while. Then he got a glass of water and went to bed. He called Ren on Sunday morning. Finn was eating cereal and watching something on the tablet and pretending, with great theatrical commitment, not to be paying attention to anything. Cal went to the living room. They talked for 35 minutes. It should have been shorter. It wasn't shorter because she said something about a patient, anonymized and careful, that made him ask a question, and the question led to a story. And the story led to something she said about the Nova Scotia coastline that led to him talking about the summer he and Finn had driven out to PEI for a week. And by the time they'd covered the PEI trip, the question of what day worked was still unresolved, and they had to circle back. Wednesday, she said. Wednesday, he agreed. He came back to the kitchen. Finn looked up from the tablet with the elaborate casualness of someone who had heard everything through the doorway and was choosing this moment to appear to have heard nothing. Cal poured himself a coffee. "How was it?" Finn asked. "Fine." "Are you going to see her again?" "Wednesday." Finn looked at his cereal for a moment. Then he nodded once, in the manner of someone who has run a project to completion and is satisfied with the result. He picked up his spoon and went back to his cereal. Cal sat down across from him. He looked at his son. The unwashed hair, the dinosaur in the pajama top. The particular quality of attention Finn brought to things he was supposedly not paying attention to, and felt something that was too layered to be simple and too large to sit comfortably inside his chest, but was there regardless, the way real things are there when they're true. The cereal bowl was almost empty. Finn ate the remaining spoonfuls with the efficiency of someone who had somewhere to be, which on a Sunday morning he absolutely did not. He stood up and took his bowl to the sink and rinsed it the way Cal had shown him, turning the tap to cold, tilting the bowl. He set it upside down on the drying rack. Then he went back to the table and sat down and picked up the tablet and looked at Cal with the expression he used when something was settled. "I told you it would be fine," Finn said. Cal wrapped both hands around his mug. "You did," he said. Finn nodded once more and went back to the tablet. Outside, the November light was coming in through the kitchen window at the angle it came in on Sunday mornings. Low and pale and very specific to this house, this table, this hour. Cal sat with his coffee and let it come in. I keep thinking about those 11 minutes Cal spent sitting in his truck. Not because they were dramatic. They weren't. He wasn't crying. He wasn't falling apart. He was just sitting there with his hands on the wheel, engine running, watching a lit-up restaurant through the windshield, doing the very human thing of talking himself out of something before he'd even tried it. I recognize that. I think most of us do, if we're honest. The convincing inner voice. The reasonable-sounding reasons. The way staying still can feel like a decision you made instead of a decision that made you. What strikes me about Cal isn't that he was afraid. Fear is just information. What strikes me is that he went in anyway, and not because he talked himself into courage, He went in because his son had called a man named Adrian on a tablet with a 7-year-old's complete confidence that the right thing and the doable thing were the same thing. Finn didn't know he was teaching his father anything. He was just doing what made sense to him. And that's the part I sit with. The idea that wisdom doesn't always come from above or ahead of us. Sometimes it comes from the small person eating cereal at your kitchen table who has, without any formal instruction, figured out that people like being treated kindly even when they're not sure yet. That's not a simple thing to know. That's actually a hard thing to know, and harder still to act on. It requires something I'd call decency, not just politeness, but a genuine orientation toward the other person, a willingness to put their comfort into the equation even when you're the one who's nervous. Cal had that. He just needed Finn to remind him he had it. Then there's Ren. She could have kept quiet about what Dana had told her. Most people would have. Most people file that kind of information away and carry it through a dinner like a small weight they don't mention. Instead, she said it in the first 5 minutes, cleared the air, made room. That took a particular kind of clarity. The ability to read a situation, understand what it actually needed, and act on that understanding even when the easier move was to stay quiet. That's intelligence in the truest sense, not cleverness. The kind that reads people carefully and responds to what's real rather than what's convenient. And then Cal, on the sidewalk, 10 steps in the wrong direction, counting, stopping, turning around. That took something. It takes something every time to choose the uncertain thing over the safe thing, to walk back toward a person when your whole body is already pointed the other way. It's not recklessness. It's not throwing caution out. It's just the decision, made quietly, that you'd rather find out than always wonder. Finn put it best, though he didn't know he was putting it at all. He rinsed his cereal bowl on a Sunday morning and looked at his father and said, "I told you it would be fine." And maybe that's it. Maybe that's the whole of it. Not the grand gesture, not the perfect speech. Just someone who loves you, looking at you across a kitchen table, completely unsurprised that you were capable of it all along.